France is the undisputed epicenter of global luxury. They dictate what we wear, what we eat, and, above all, what we drink. But there is a dark secret, almost a national betrayal, hidden in the cellars of the country's southwest. Let's talk about one of the most expensive, exclusive, and strictly regulated beverages on the planet. It is an amber liquid that has wet the lips of Russian czars, British royalty, and Silicon Valley billionaires. The French government protects its production with laws that border on clinical paranoia by regulating the soil and regulating the clock. They even protect by law a black parasitic fungus that devours the walls of their buildings. And here is the great paradox. The French don't drink it. The numbers are brutal, as 98% of what is produced in this region is bottled and shipped out of the country. The French themselves barely touch it. For them, it's not a drink to enjoy on a Friday night. It is an identity export product, which is essentially printing wood-flavored bills and sending them abroad to sustain their luxury economy. We are talking, of course, about cognac. But how do you get the whole world to pay fortunes for something you don't even want on your own table? The answer isn't a master marketing strategy, but rather a series of catastrophes, maritime accidents, and a sickly obsession with control. The first of these catastrophes almost wiped cognac off the face of the earth forever. Let's travel back to the late 19th century. Before cognac was synonymous with status, it was simply a thriving industry in the Charente region, north of Bordeaux. But then, a lethal enemy crossed the ocean, and it wasn't an invading army. It was a nearly microscopic insect called phylloxera. This root-devouring aphid unleashed itself upon French vineyards like a true biblical plague, and there was no cure. There was no pesticide that worked. In a matter of years, the plague wiped out 85% of the vines in the cognac-producing region. The entire industry collapsed, family fortunes turned to dust, and the liquid gold stopped flowing. France was desperate, and to save their precious spirit, they had to swallow their pride and make a drastic decision: graft their dying vines with American roots, which were immune to the insect. But this changed the rules of the game, and the rich, traditional grapes they used before almost completely disappeared. In their place, the French were forced to bet their future on a leftover grape, a tough survivor called Ugni Blanc. On its own, this grape produces one of the worst wines in the world. It is thin, weak, jaw-clenchingly acidic, and frankly unpleasant to the palate. Nobody in their right mind would order a glass of Ugni Blanc wine for dinner. But in the world of extreme distillation, this flaw was about to become an absolute superpower. That brutal acidity was exactly the chemical armor the liquid needed to survive the fire and transform. That extreme acidity of the Ugni Blanc grape is today the region's best-kept secret. But the idea of distilling wine wasn't invented by refined French winemakers. In fact, it was a logistical trick, an emergency solution invented by foreign merchants who just wanted to avoid bankruptcy. To understand this, we have to go back in time a bit, to the ports of southwestern France. They were packed with Dutch merchant ships arriving in search of salt, wood, and the local wine, but they faced a massive problem. Wine is mostly water. It took up an immense amount of space in the ship's holds. And ocean voyages were long, hot, and brutal. French wine couldn't survive the trip. It would sour, rot, and turn into vinegar before docking. And in the maritime trade, losing cargo means losing everything. The Dutch, masters of mercantile efficiency, found a purely mathematical solution. They decided to boil the wine on the French coast before loading it. By applying fire, they evaporated the water and concentrated the alcohol into a much denser liquid. Less volume meant more space in the hold. More space meant more profit. They called this liquid brandewine, which in Dutch literally means burned wine, and that is where the word brandy comes from. The original plan was ridiculously simple and unglamorous. Boil the wine, transport it in wooden barrels, arrive at the destination port, add water back in, and sell it as reconstituted wine. It was basically the ancient version of powdered juice. But the physics of the ocean had other plans. During the weeks that the Atlantic crossing lasted, something invisible happened in the dark of those ships. That rough liquid wasn't resting in inert glass. It was locked inside living oak barrels. Add the suffocating heat of the journey, the violent rocking of the waves, and the porosity of the wood. The barrel acted as a chemical stomach, and the concentrated alcohol dissolved the sugars, tannins, and deep oils of the oak. When the sailors finally opened the barrels upon arrival and tasted the liquid, they were paralyzed. It was no longer a harsh wine concentrate. It had transformed. It was smooth, complex, with notes of vanilla and spices that didn't exist when they set sail. The idea of watering it back down became an absurdity. Brandy was born entirely by accident, slow cooked by the sea, and the wood out in the middle of the Atlantic. But brandy is just the rough draft, and what turns a simple brandy into an authentic cognac is a French obsession with control that borders on madness. For that liquid to be called cognac, it's not enough to just make it well. You have to obey a set of dictatorial rules, so strict that they strike terror into distillers. And the most stressful rule of all has to do with a clock that stops for no one, marking a non-negotiable expiration date. The geography rule. The first rule of cognac is geographic and dictatorial, meaning it cannot be made just anywhere in France. If you distill the exact same wine, with the same grapes, the same method, and the same barrels, but you find yourself just 1 kilometer outside the invisible border of the cognac region, what you have is a simple brandy. French law will destroy you if you try to market it under any other name. The copper rule. Then comes the trial by fire in copper, as the acidic liquid must obligatorily be distilled twice, and not in just any machine, but in traditional copper stills with a very specific onion shape. Copper is not an aesthetic choice. It is a chemical trap. It catches and eliminates the aggressive sulfur compounds from fermentation, sculpting that smooth texture the world pays so dearly for. The rule of time, but the most ruthless rule of all is the law of time. This is where production turns into a race against the clock. By irrefutable decree of the French government, the distillation of the autumn harvest has an absolute deadline. It must end exactly before midnight on March 31st. Not a single minute of grace is given. If the clock strikes 1 second past midnight on April 1st, and you're still spitting out alcohol, you've just lost your entire year's effort. That entire batch is disqualified forever, making March nights in the region a time of pure industrial stress. Producers don't sleep. They monitor the valves, the pressure, and the fire, as if they were diffusing an explosive. Once the clear liquid beats the clock, it is locked away in barrels, made exclusively from oak, from French forests, and there, the wait begins. With such a level of nobility and suffocating rules, one would assume that the European aristocracy kept this industry alive, but that wasn't the case. By the late 90s, cognac was slowly dying. Global sales were plummeting, and the market saw it as a stale drink. The boring glass that old men held in dusty clubs. Producers were terrified because younger generations were simply ignoring it entirely. Economic salvation didn't come from Paris or the palaces of London. It came from the streets of New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. It came straight from hip-hop. In the early 2000s, rap culture adopted cognac as its ultimate badge of honor. When Busta Rhymes dropped the global hit Pass the Courvoisier, sales for that brand skyrocketed. 30% in weeks. Icons like Jay-Z or Snoop Dogg showcased these century-old bottles in their music videos. In the blink of an eye, the global perception fractured. Cognac stopped being the symbol of old European money and mutated into the ultimate trophy of new American success. The liquid proof of having made it on the streets. Sales in the United States exploded with such violence that French cellars, which plan their reserves decades in advance, panicked over shortages. It was a fascinating culture clash, conservative French families being rescued from economic ruin by urban culture across the ocean. Cognac was flowing to America, money was returning to France. But on the stone walls of those same millionaire cellars, something dark was growing. A silent invader was about to unleash an unprecedented legal war. While that amber liquid rests inside oak barrels for years, and even decades, an inevitable biological phenomenon occurs. The wood is alive and breathes, it is porous, and through those microscopic pores, every year, a portion of the alcohol slowly evaporates and escapes into the atmosphere. The region's producers, with that poetic French elegance, christened it the angel's share. It sounds romantic, but in business terms, it is a massive financial hemorrhage. Every 12 months, the equivalent of millions of bottles of cognac vanishes into thin air across the region. To put it in perspective, the amount of pure alcohol that escapes into the city's sky each year would be enough to fill over 20 million liters. All that invisible vapor forms a sort of microclimate over the rooftops, an imperceptible mist that envelops the air. Millions of dollars literally evaporating right before their creators' eyes. But that floating alcohol doesn't disappear without a trace. It feeds something else. If you walk the streets of Cognac and pay attention to the buildings, you'll notice something deeply unsettling. The stone walls, rooftops, fences, and even tree trunks near the cellars are covered by a strange black crust. It looks like industrial soot, as if a fire had recently ravaged the area. But it's not dirt. It is a living organism. A microscopic fungus called Bodonia. This fungus doesn't grow just anywhere in the world. It is, in essence, an addict. It is an organism that feeds on and survives exclusively off the alcohol vapors escaping from the aging barrels. For centuries, this black fungus acted as a natural spy, an unbribable biological whistleblower. In past eras, when the government tried to collect taxes from clandestine distilleries, tax inspectors didn't even have to search for hidden stills. They just had to walk down the town's streets and see which houses had walls stained a shiny black. The fungus always revealed exactly where the alcohol was hiding. Today, the fungus no longer hunts down illegal distillers, but it did spark a civil war in the region. For decades, local residents, fed up with seeing how Bourgogne ruined and stained the freshly painted facades of their homes black, filed massive lawsuits against the giant cognac producers. They labeled it severe industrial pollution, demanding that the sellers pay for the constant cleaning of all neighboring properties and halt the emission of vapors. The conflict escalated all the way to the French courts, and the resulting ruling is one of the most striking examples of how France protects its true commercial treasures. The judges ruled against the citizens, formally declaring that the spread of the black fungus was not corporate negligence, but the inevitable consequence of an economic activity of supreme national interest. In other words, the government ruled that the cognac industry is so vital to the country's identity that the fungus accompanying it is protected by law. If you want to live in the region where the most prestigious drink in the world is made, the legal price you must accept is having your house covered in black. Think about how absurd and fascinating all of this is. France has created a liquid empire. They care for the land where the grapes grow with an almost religious fanaticism. They design draconian laws that mark midnight as the absolute limit to extinguish the fire. They defend in their highest courts a parasitic fungus that dirties their own citizens' walls. All of this sacrifice is made to protect the soul of their most iconic spirit. And after all that Herculean effort, all that patience lasting decades, they put it in boxes and ship it thousands of miles away. The French will proudly tell you that cognac is their greatest masterpiece, but when dinner time comes, they prefer to open a Bordeaux wine or celebrate with champagne. For them, this drink isn't for daily consumption. It's a silent ambassador. It is the tangible proof that no one in the world understands patience, luxury, and the chemistry of wood quite like they do. The next time you see a bottle of cognac on a liquor store shelf, at the bar of an exclusive club, or in your favorite artist's music video, you won't just see an expensive drink anymore. It's not just alcohol and sugar. What you have in front of you is pure bottled geography. You'll see centuries of history and obsession encapsulated in glass. You'll see the result of an insect plague that wiped out the original vineyards, a maritime accident that turned cheap wine into gold, a relentless clock that terrifies distillers in March, and a dark fungus that a government decided to protect over the complaints of its own people. All that perfectly ordered chaos fits inside a 700 milliliter bottle. If this story made you see something you thought you knew in a completely different way, hit like and subscribe to the channel. Every week, we dig into the most ignored details to find the hidden history behind the things the world takes for granted.